Midland ran the road, losing itself as it swept round the grassy curve, and was shut out by the straggling ends of pine wood, which here and there ran down the hillside like tongues of flame. The road was rugged, but still we seemed to fly over it with feverish haste. I could not understand what the haste meant, but the driver was exceedingly bent on losing no time in reaching Borgo au Prund. I was told this road in summertime is excellent, but that it had not yet been put in order after the winter snows. In the rest of it, in this respect, it is different from the general run of roads in the Carpathians, for it is an old tradition. They are not to be kept in too good order. Of old the horse potters would not repair them, lest the Turks should think that they were preparing to bring in foreign troops, and so hasten the war, which was always really at loading point. Beyond the green swelling hills of Meadowland rose mighty slopes of forest up to the lofty steeps of the Carpathians themselves. Right and left of us they towered, with the afternoon sun falling full upon them and bringing out the glorious colors of this beautiful range. Deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown where grass and rock mingled, and an endless perspective of jagged rocks and pointed crags, till these themselves lost in the distance, where the snowy peaks rose grandly. Here and there seemed mighty rifts in the mountains, through which, as the sun began to sink, we saw now and again the white gleam of falling water. One of my companions touched my arm as we swept round the base of a hill and opened up the lofty snow-covered peak of the mountain, which seemed, as we wound on our serpentine way, to be right before us. "Look, Eistensick, God's seat," and he crossed himself reverently. As we wound on our endless way, and the sun sank lower and lower behind us, the shadows of the evening began to creep round us. This was emphasized by the fact that the snowy mountain top still held the sunset and seemed to glow out with a delicate cool pink. Here and there we passed some Selziks and Slovaks, all in picturesque attire. But I noticed that Gotire was painfully prevalent. By the roadside were many crosses, and as we swept by, my companions all crossed themselves. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not even turn round as we approached, but seemed in self-surrender of devotion to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. There were many things new to me. For instance, hayricks in the trees, and here and there very beautiful masses of weeping birch, their white stems shining like silver through the delicate green of the leaves. Now and again we passed the later wagon, the ordinary peasant's cart, with its long snake-like vertebra, calculated to suit the inequalities of the road. On this were sure to be seated quite a group of homecoming peasants, the Selziks with their white, and the Slovaks with their colored sheepskins, the latter carrying lance fashion, their long staffs with axe at end. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness. The gloom of the trees, oak, beech, pine, though in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hills. As we ascended through the pass, the dark firs stood out here and there against the background of the late-lying snow. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness, which here and there bestrewed the trees, producing a peculiar, weird, and solemn effect. which carried on the thoughts and grim fancies engendered early in the evening. When the falling sunset threw into strange relief the ghost-like clouds which amongst the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the valleys. Sometimes the hills were so steep that, despite our driver's haste, the horses could only go slowly. I wished to get down and walk up them, as we do at home, but the driver would not hear of it. "No, no," he said. "You must not walk here. The dogs are too fierce." And then he added, with what he evidently meant for grim pleasantry, for he looked round to catch the approving smile of the rest, "And you may have enough of such matters before you go to sleep." The only stop we would make was a moment's pause to light his lamps. When it grew dark, there seemed to be some excitement amongst the passengers, and they kept speaking to him one after the other, as though urging him to further speed. He lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild cries of encouragement urged them on to further extortions. Then, through the darkness, I could see a sort of patch of grey light ahead of us, as though we were a cleft in the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its great leather springs and swayed like a boat tossing on a stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew more level and we appeared to fly along. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and to frown down upon us. We were entering the Borgo Pass. One by one, several of the passengers offered me gifts, which they pressed upon me with an earnestness which would take no denial. These were certainly of odd and varied kind, but each was given in simple good faith, with kindly word and a blessing. That strange mixture of fear-meaning movements which I had seen outside the hotel at Bistritz, the sign of crosses and the guard against the evil eye. Then, as we flew along, the driver leaned forward, and on each side the passengers, craning over the edge of the coach, peering eagerly into the darkness. It was evident that something very exciting was either happening or expected. But though I asked each passenger, no one would give me the slightest explanation. This state of excitement kept on for some little time, and at last we saw before us the pass opening out on the eastern side. There were dark, rolling clouds overhead, and in the air the heavy, oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and that now we had got into the thunderous one. I was now myself looking out for the conveyance, expecting to see the glare of lamps through the blackness, but all was dark. The only light was the flickering ray of our own lamps, in which the stream from our hard-driven horses rose in wide clouds. We could now see the sandy road lying white before us, but there was on it no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had best do, when the driver looked at his watch, said to the others something which I could hardly hear. It was spoken so quietly and in so low a tone that I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then turning to me, he said in German worse than my own, "There is no carriage here. The heir is not expected after all. He will now come on to Bukovina, and return tomorrow, or the next day, better the next day." Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst the coarser screams from the peasants, and a universal crossing of themselves, a clocher with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps, as the rays fell on them, that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight. As he turned to us, he said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend," the man stammered in reply. "The English air was in a hurry." To which the stranger replied, "That is why I suppose you wish him to go on to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth, as white as ivory. One of my companions whispered to another the line from Burger's Lenore, "Dindai toten retna skranel." From the dead, travel fast. The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passenger turned his face away, at the same time putting up his 2 fingers and crossing himself. "Give me the heir's luggage," said the driver, and with exceeding alacrity, my bags were handed out and put into the calash. And then I descended from the side of the coach. As the calash was close alongside, the driver helping me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he shook his reins, and the horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the pass. As I looked back, I saw the steam from the horses of the coach by the light of lamps, and projected against it the figures of my late companions crossing themselves. Then the driver cracked his whip and called to his horses, and they swept on their way to Bukovina. As I sank into the darkness, I felt a strange chill, and a lonely feeling came over me. But a cloak was thrown over my shoulders, and a rug across my knees, and the driver said in excellent German, "The night is chill, mein Herr, and my master, the Count, bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of Silvitsky, the plum brandy of the country, underneath the seat, if you should require it." I did not take any, but it was a comfort to know it was there, all the same. I felt a little strangely. I did not, and not a little frightened. I think had there been any alternative, I should have taken it, instead of prosecuting that unknown night journey. The carriage went at a hard pace, straight along. Then we made a complete turn, and went along another straight road. It seemed to me that we were simply going over and over the same ground again. So I took note of some salient point, and found out this was so. I would have liked to ask the driver what all this meant, but I really feared to do so, for I thought that, placed as I was, any protest would have had no effect in case there had been an intention to delay. By and by, however, I was curious to know how time was passing. I struck a match, and by its flame looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, for I suppose the general superstition about midnight was increasing by my recent experiences. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in the farmhouse far down the road, a long agonized wailing, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another and another, till borne on the wind, which now sighed softly through the pass. A wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it through the gloom of the night. At the first howl, the horses began to strain and rear, but the driver spoke to them soothingly, and they quieted down, but shivered and sweated as though after a running away from sudden fright. Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of us, began a louder and sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way, for I was mingled to jump from the calash and run, whilst they reared again, and plunged madly, so that the driver had to use all his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was able to descend and to stand before them. He petted and soothed them, and whispered something in their ears. I have heard of horse tamers doing, and with extraordinary effort, for under his caresses they became quite manageable again. Though they still trembled, the driver again took his seat, and shaking his reins, started off at great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass, he suddenly turned down a narrow roadway which ran sharply to the right.